A solo trip is often described as a quiet act of healing, a deliberate step away from noise and expectation. For Asha Kreimer, it became something else entirely, something unfinished. In 2015, she vanished in California without leaving a trace behind. No final message, no confirmed sighting, no explanation. No. What happened in those final hours remains unanswered, and perhaps more disturbingly, unanswerable. This is not simply a missing person case that faded into obscurity over time. It is a silence that continues to exist, unresolved and undisturbed. There are no dramatic discoveries, no confessions, no clear suspects, only absence. And in that absence, a question lingers with quiet persistence. Was this an impulsive disappearance, or did someone somewhere already know how her story would end? If you find yourself drawn into stories that do not offer closure, where logic struggles against uncertainty, you are not alone. These cases invite a different kind of attention, one that lingers longer than comfort allows. Before we go further, remember to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this are not just meant to be heard, they are meant to be remembered. California, in the public imagination, is movement and sunlight, a place where strangers arrive and disappear every day without consequence. It is a landscape shaped by freedom, by the idea that reinvention is always possible. For solo travelers, it offers both anonymity and belonging. You can be anyone here or no one at all, and no one will question it. The streets are filled with a constant rhythm of life, tourists moving between destinations, cafes humming with conversation, coastal roads stretching endlessly beside the ocean. Nothing feels inherently threatening. In fact, everything appears open, accessible, and alive. It is precisely this openness that creates an illusion of safety, one that rarely invites suspicion or caution. But cities like this also carry a different truth beneath the surface. The same anonymity that offers freedom can also conceal intention. Faces blur together, movements go unnoticed, and patterns dissolve into the ordinary. When something does go wrong, it often does so quietly. Not with disruption, but with disappearance subtle enough to escape immediate detection. Before Asha vanished, nothing about her presence suggested she would become part of that hidden narrative. She was not running from anything obvious, nor was she visibly distressed. To those who knew her, she represented a certain kind of balance, independent, thoughtful, and capable of navigating unfamiliar spaces without fear or hesitation. Asha Kreimer was in her late 20s or early 30s, an age often associated with transition rather than instability. She had a stable job, maintained regular contact with people in her life, and showed no outward signs of crisis. Her decision to travel alone was not unusual for her. It was, in many ways, consistent with who she had always been. She valued solitude, but not isolation. The distinction between the two was clear to her, and she understood it intuitively. Solitude gave her space to observe, reflect, and move through environments without distraction. It was not an escape from life, but a conscious choice. Friends described her as grounded, deliberate, and never acting without thoughtful reason behind her decisions. During her trip, she maintained steady communication with those close to her. Messages, updates, and brief glimpses into her experience were shared regularly. Nothing in those exchanges suggested fear, urgency, or emotional disturbance. There were no hidden warnings, no coded signals, and no subtle shifts in tone. Everything appeared consistent, stable, and calmly predictable throughout her journey. Some acquaintances would later recall something difficult to define, not fear or visible anxiety, but a subtle inward shift in her demeanor. It was as if her attention had turned toward something unresolved, something quietly occupying her thoughts. At the time, no one considered it significant. Only in hindsight did these faint impressions begin to carry weight within the narrative. Her family never questioned her ability to move through the world alone. They recognized her independence and trusted her judgment. Any concern they felt existed in the background, vague and unfocused, not strong enough to challenge her decisions. It was the kind of quiet awareness that accompanies distance, present but not urgent, acknowledged but never acted upon. Friends described her as emotionally steady, someone who did not react impulsively or withdraw without explanation. She was consistent, grounded in her behavior, and predictable in her communication. That consistency would later become one of the most troubling elements of the case, because what happened to her did not reflect who she had always shown herself to be. She was traveling alone without a partner or close companion to observe her movements or decisions in real time. This absence offered freedom, but it also removed a layer of accountability. Without someone to confirm her actions, every detail became uncertain. What she did, where she went, and why she chose certain paths all had to be reconstructed after she was gone. The environment she moved through amplified this uncertainty in subtle ways. Temporary accommodations, short-term stays, and transient spaces are designed for efficiency rather than familiarity. People pass through them without forming connections. Identities are confirmed briefly, then forgotten. Within these spaces, individuals exist close to one another, yet remain fundamentally unknown to each other. In environments like these, anonymity functions as both a source of comfort and a hidden vulnerability. Movements pass without scrutiny and interactions remain brief, often lacking depth or memory. Doors close quietly, sealing off whatever occurs inside from outside awareness. This design fosters a sense of safety, yet it also creates unseen gaps where actions unfold without interruption, leaving no immediate trace or witness behind. For Asha, nothing in that environment appeared threatening. There were no warnings, no clear signs that anything was about to change. Everything around her reflected normalcy, the same patterns experienced by countless others in similar places. And that is what makes her disappearance so unsettling. It did not rise from chaos, but from a moment that seemed entirely ordinary. In the final stretch before her disappearance, nothing in Asha Kreimer's behavior suggested rupture or fear. She was seen within the vicinity of her accommodation, moving through familiar temporary routines. Her presence did not attract attention, nor did it trigger concern. To anyone observing casually, she was simply another traveler passing through, following a path that seemed ordinary, predictable, and unremarkable. Earlier that day, her communications remained consistent with previous patterns. Messages sent to friends or family carried no urgency, no hidden distress. The tone was measured, calm, and aligned with someone at ease. There were no abrupt endings, no unanswered questions left behind in her words. Everything about her digital footprint suggested continuity rather than disruption, stability rather than impending absence. There was no final call that hinted at fear, no sudden silence during an active exchange. Instead, communication simply stopped at a point that did not feel significant at the time. This is often how such disappearances unfold. Not with a dramatic final moment, but with an absence that only gains meaning when viewed in hindsight. Some accounts suggest that she may have left her accommodation alone later that evening. This detail, while unconfirmed, introduces a critical shift. Movement without documentation creates uncertainty. Without a companion or a clear destination, her path becomes fragmented. Every possible direction becomes plausible, and every interpretation remains equally unsupported by concrete evidence. What stands out is not what she did, but what cannot be confirmed. There is no verified timeline that maps her movements after a certain point, no recorded entry into another location, no transaction that marks her presence elsewhere. It is as though the narrative surrounding her simply pauses, leaving investigators to fill in gaps that may never be resolved. The timing of her disappearance plays a subtle but significant role. Evening transitions into night in a way that reduces visibility without eliminating activity. People are still present, but attention shifts inward. Streets remain active, but observation becomes less focused. It is a time when movement can occur without being fully registered by others. If she did leave during these hours, she would have entered an environment where anonymity increases naturally. The surrounding area, likely familiar in layout but unfamiliar in detail, would offer both access and obscurity. She could walk freely, but also unnoticed. This duality defines many disappearances that occur without immediate witnesses. There are no public reports of struggle, no indications of confrontation in the spaces she was believed to have occupied. This absence of disturbance complicates interpretation. It suggests either a controlled interaction or a voluntary movement. In both cases, the lack of disruption prevents investigators from identifying a clear point of escalation. The moment she vanished is not marked by an event, but by a transition, one state becoming another without visible interruption. She existed within a system of observation, however limited, and then she did not. No alarm was triggered. No immediate search was initiated. The disappearance unfolded within the margins of normal activity. It was only after time passed without contact that concern began to take shape. Family members, accustomed to regular updates, noticed the silence. At first, it may have been interpreted as a delay, a gap in communication that did not immediately signal danger. But as hours extended into days, that interpretation became harder to maintain. Friends who had received prior messages began to reassess their last interactions. Nothing stood out initially, but the absence that followed redefined those exchanges. Words that once felt routine were revisited with new scrutiny. This retrospective analysis is common, an attempt to extract meaning from moments that were not designed to carry it. The place where she had been staying became a focal point of concern. Her failure to return introduced a physical absence that could not be ignored. Personal belongings may have remained, suggesting she did not intend to leave permanently. This detail, while subtle, adds weight to the possibility that her disappearance was unplanned. Once her absence was confirmed as unusual, authorities were notified. The transition from personal concern to official investigation marks a shift in perspective. What was once a private worry becomes a public matter. Yet even at this stage, the available information remained limited, fragmented, and insufficient to establish a clear direction. Search efforts began, but they were constrained by the lack of a defined starting point. Without a confirmed last location beyond a general area, the scope of investigation expanded rapidly. Resources were deployed, but focus remained diffuse. This is one of the inherent challenges in cases where the timeline itself is uncertain. As investigators began to gather statements, inconsistencies emerged, not necessarily in content, but in clarity. Some individuals may have recalled seeing someone matching her description, but without certainty. Memory, especially in busy environments, is often imprecise. What is seen is not always retained with accuracy. There is also the possibility that someone did notice something unusual, but did not recognize its significance at the time. This delay between observation and interpretation creates a gap that cannot always be closed. By the time information is shared, context has shifted and details have faded or altered in subtle ways. Surveillance, if present, did not provide a definitive answer. Either the coverage was incomplete, or the relevant footage did not capture her movements clearly. This absence of visual confirmation removes one of the most reliable forms of reconstruction. Without it, a timeline remains dependent on human recollection and inference. Perhaps the most unsettling element is what followed her disappearance in terms of data absence. Her phone, a device that typically anchors modern identity, was either not recovered or ceased to provide useful information. There were no clear location pings, no extended activity that could guide investigators toward a specific area. Financial records also failed to offer direction. No transactions were recorded after a certain point. No use of cards that might indicate continued movement. In a world where activity is constantly logged, this sudden silence creates a void. It suggests either intentional disconnection or a situation where continuation was not possible. When digital, physical, and testimonial evidence all converge into absence, the result is not clarity, but fragmentation. Each missing piece does not simply reduce information, it alters the entire structure of understanding. The case no longer follows a linear path. Instead, it becomes a network of possibilities without confirmation. And within that network, one fact remains constant. Asha Kreimer did not reappear. No trace emerged in the days that followed, nor in the weeks or months after. The system that once recorded her presence now held only her absence. But what investigators would soon discover would only deepen the mystery. When investigators reconstructed Asha Kreimer's final known movements, they returned to the last confirmed location where she had been seen. They searched for continuity, but found none. The area was examined methodically, with each possible route and transition point mapped carefully. Yet the environment provided no defining trace or anchor to establish a precise moment of disappearance. Witnesses in the surrounding area were interviewed, but their accounts rarely aligned with certainty. Some described a figure they believed might have been her, while others recalled only vague movement without detail. In transient environments, memory is unstable and easily influenced. What people remember is shaped not only by direct observation, but also by suggestion, time, and uncertainty. Surveillance footage, when available, became a focal point of analysis. Cameras placed at entrances, hallways, or nearby streets were reviewed repeatedly. However, either coverage was incomplete or resolution insufficient. No clear image emerged that could conclusively track her path beyond a certain threshold. The absence of visual confirmation did not eliminate possibilities, but it multiplied them. There was no definitive crime scene, no location where an event could be said to have occurred. This absence complicated every aspect of the investigation. Without a fixed point of origin, there could be no controlled perimeter, no forensic concentration. Instead, the case expanded outward, diffused across a wide and uncertain landscape of potential scenarios. Investigators considered the possibility that something had been overlooked in the earliest stages. In cases lacking immediate clarity, initial assumptions can obscure subtle indicators. A detail dismissed as irrelevant may later prove critical. Yet without a clear direction, identifying such details becomes an exercise in speculation rather than discovery. As the investigation progressed, the case entered public awareness. Media coverage framed it as a disappearance without explanation, a narrative that both informed and unsettled the audience. The idea that someone could vanish in a populated area without resistance or witness introduced a quiet unease, particularly among those who traveled alone. Public reaction followed a familiar pattern. Concern expanded into speculation, and speculation into theory. Online discussions attempted to reconstruct her final hours using limited information. Each theory filled a gap, but none could be verified. The narrative became fragmented, shaped as much by imagination as by fact, reflecting collective uncertainty rather than objective truth. For the family, this exposure created an additional layer of pressure. Private grief became subject to public interpretation. Every statement was examined, every detail scrutinized. The need for answers intensified, yet the information available to support those answers remained insufficient. The investigation continued, but clarity did not increase at the same pace. Despite extensive efforts, no official suspect was identified. The absence of a clear individual to focus on prevented the case from advancing in a conventional direction. Instead, investigators were left with categories of possibility rather than defined persons. Each category carried its own logic, but none could be substantiated with decisive evidence. One possibility centered on an unknown individual, someone who encountered her by chance. This theory aligns with the unpredictability of open environments, where interactions occur without prior connection. Yet without witness confirmation or physical evidence, this scenario remains hypothetical, constructed from probability rather than observation. Another possibility involved someone she may have met briefly, an acquaintance formed during travel. These interactions, often casual and unrecorded, can leave minimal trace. A conversation, a shared space, a temporary alignment of paths. If such a person existed, their identity may never have been formally documented, making them effectively invisible to investigation. There is also the unsettling notion of prior observation, that someone may have noticed her earlier, not in passing, but with intent. This theory suggests a level of premeditation, a decision formed before the final moment. However, it requires evidence of surveillance or pattern recognition, neither of which has been publicly established in her case. Parallel to these external theories, attention turned inward, toward aspects of her life that were less visible. Investigators considered whether there were pressures or circumstances not immediately apparent. Financial strain, emotional conflict, unresolved decisions. These elements, if present, might influence behavior in ways that are not externally detectable. Yet no confirmed evidence ever emerged to support internal causes. Those who knew her reported no clear instability or distress. Subtle behavioral shifts were noticed but never viewed as warning signs. The absence of documented problems does not rule out hidden struggle, yet it significantly weakens the strength of any psychological explanation proposed later. The defining feature of the case remained unchanged over time. After a certain point, all trace of activity stopped completely. No financial transactions, no phone usage, no digital presence of any kind. In an era where nearly every movement leaves a record, such total silence is extremely rare, and suggests a sudden, complete disruption without residual signals remaining. This creates a fundamental paradox for investigators and observers alike. The more absolute the absence becomes, the fewer viable explanations remain. Every theory must confront the same core question: how can someone vanish so completely without leaving any trace behind? The question persists not because it lacks answers, but because no answer can be fully verified or proven. As time passed, the investigation did not formally close, but it gradually lost momentum. Without new evidence, progress slowed until the case settled into unresolved status. It remained open in record, yet inactive in practice. What remained was not direction, but absence itself, shaping interpretation and leaving the case suspended in uncertainty rather than resolution. When a person disappears without leaving a trace, the human mind does not accept emptiness easily. It begins to construct explanations, not necessarily to solve the mystery, but to reduce the discomfort of not knowing. In the case of Asha Kreimer, each theory attempts to impose structure onto absence. Yet every explanation, when examined closely, reveals its own fractures. One of the most discussed possibilities is that Asha's disappearance originated from within rather than from an external threat. This theory suggests the presence of personal conflict, a pressure that may not have been visible to those around her. It frames her final actions as intentional, even if not fully understood, positioning her as both subject and catalyst of her own vanishing. The strength of this interpretation lies in its psychological plausibility. Human behavior is not always transparent, even to those who appear stable and composed. Internal struggles can remain concealed, especially in individuals who value independence. A solo trip in this context may represent more than leisure. It could reflect a need for distance, reflection, or escape. However, this theory encounters immediate limitations. There is no concrete evidence indicating that Asha was experiencing distress significant enough to prompt disappearance. No documented conflict, no financial irregularities, no behavioral pattern that suggested withdrawal. The absence of such indicators does not invalidate the theory, but it weakens its foundation considerably. In contrast, another theory shifts focus outward, toward the possibility of an opportunistic encounter. In this scenario, Asha becomes the target of someone who recognized vulnerability in her solitude. The setting supports this idea. A transient environment filled with unfamiliar individuals creates conditions where brief interactions can carry unintended consequences. This interpretation aligns with known behavioral patterns of opportunistic offenders. Such individuals do not necessarily plan extensively, but they remain attentive to circumstance. They identify moments where resistance is minimal, where visibility is reduced, and where intervention is unlikely. A traveler moving alone at night can, under certain conditions, fit that profile. Yet this theory is also constrained by the absence of evidence. There are no confirmed witnesses who observed an interaction, no physical traces indicating confrontation, no surveillance capturing a definitive moment. The scenario is plausible, but plausibility alone cannot sustain certainty. It remains a constructed explanation, not a verified account. When both theories are placed side by side, a clear pattern emerges. One is driven by internal factors but lacks external evidence. The other relies on external action but lacks internal context. Both attempt explanation, yet neither accounts for complete absence of trace, leaving essential questions unresolved. This tension between explanation and evidence reveals a broader limitation in understanding such cases. Human beings naturally seek narrative structure, often beyond what data can support. A flawed story feels more acceptable than none. In doing so, coherence can be mistaken for truth, and possibility for reality. Which theory feels more convincing may depend less on evidence and more on perspective. Some may find the internal explanation more aligned with human complexity. Others may see greater likelihood in external threat within an open environment. But belief, in this context, does not equate to resolution. It only reveals preference. From a psychological standpoint, both scenarios intersect at a critical point. Vulnerability is not always visible. A person may appear composed while navigating unfamiliar territory, yet still be exposed to risk. Trust in one's environment can reduce vigilance, especially when no immediate threat is perceived. This is not naivety, but a function of normal cognition. Opportunistic behavior, on the other hand, relies on this very dynamic. It does not require elaborate planning, only awareness and timing. The absence of resistance or witness does not necessarily indicate consent or control. It may simply reflect the conditions in which the event occurred, conditions that favor concealment over confrontation. There is also the unsettling possibility that the truth contains elements of both theories, that internal movement and external encounter intersected in a way that cannot be reconstructed. A decision to step outside, a moment of distraction, a presence unnoticed until it was too late. Such intersections are difficult to prove precisely because they are brief and unobserved. Beyond psychology, the case invites a philosophical reflection on the nature of human existence. Western thought often frames individuals as capable of both rationality and harm, suggesting that morality is not fixed, but situational. A person may act with kindness in one moment and with indifference in another, depending on context and impulse. In contrast, Eastern philosophical traditions emphasize the chain of cause and effect, where every action, no matter how small, contributes to a larger outcome. Within this framework, Asha's final decision, whatever it may have been, becomes part of a sequence rather than an isolated event. Not deterministic, but interconnected. These perspectives do not solve the mystery, but they expand its meaning. They shift the focus from what happened to how such an event can exist at all. They remind us that absence is not empty, but filled with possibilities that cannot be verified, only contemplated. And in that contemplation, discomfort persists. The disappearance of Asha Kreimer remains unresolved, not from lack of investigation, but from the absence of clear, definable evidence. No suspect has been confirmed, and no conclusion reached. Her case exists in suspension between known facts and what cannot be proven, leaving persistent uncertainty for those who study it. Her family, like many others facing similar disappearances, continues to wait, not only for closure, but for recognition of truth. Even a small detail could restore continuity to a story that ended too abruptly. Until then, her absence remains both a personal loss and an unresolved public question. Cases like this rarely end in resolution, but instead in reflection. They expose the limits of observation, the fragility of routine, and how unpredictable intersections shape human life. A single unnoticed moment can change everything, and once it passes, it cannot be recovered, reconstructed, or fully understood again. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.